and welcome to News Desk. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting.
She is, and I'm Viresh Banerjee.
Now, it's something that people in cities from Cape Town to Barcelona say they're living with every day. While tourism is booming, it's running headfirst into the realities of housing pressure, rising costs and local frustration. Jeff Bezos renting out Venice for his wedding? Well, that's the symbol. Locals being priced out of their own streets. That's the story.
We think that one big billionaire can't rent a city.
We're protesting because we think that Venice can still be a place to live.
The rings!
The city is under assault by tourists and is depopulating. It's becoming a Disneyland.
So, some striking scenes there from Venice, where billionaire Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez tied the knot last week. And it sets the stage for this week's News Desk discussion, which we've titled Overtourism, Locals Priced Out, Shut Out, Moved Out.
And we've already had you guys responding to this post on our community post, and we've had some responses and some comments already. I'd like to read out some of them. This comment from Aryan Shukla 7305, who's saying tourism is a lifeblood for much of these places, but it shouldn't go from helping communities to their destruction. You also have NMSLNESSES. That's the username, I didn't make that up. And this person is saying, simple problem with simple solutions. Give local government the right to tax tourists, and you can fine-tune how much tourists you want. I think that's something that some governments are already doing, but we'll discuss that. You also have this comment from Johnny Bling, 1253, Alex, and this person is saying, tourism can be controlled. It's up to the government to enforce restrictions and regulations. So another comment there on the role of government there. And just one last comment I'd like to bring up. This is from @Seiki Machan, I hope I got that right, saying tourism has pros and cons. While it helps our economy, such as creating jobs and higher revenue because of the money spent by the tourists, it also hurts our environment due to overcrowding and higher demands that affect our natural supplies. So an environmental aspect that is also coming in. Be worth discussing that if we can get to it. So just a sample of the comments that we've been getting so far on our community post. Please make sure to keep those comments flowing, because the comments make this discussion a discussion that we'll be having in this studio with my colleague from DW Business, Daniel Winter, for whom it's his first news desk, right?
It's my first ever news desk, and I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy
that you are here.
I'm a long-time fan, first-time guest, so it's great to be in the famous studio with you guys.
We love first-timers, and especially on this topic on overtourism, which is so important. And I don't know if a lot of people can see you in what you're wearing, but you are dressed as a tourist, so you are really in character. So
I'm in
so
holiday mode right now.
Thanks so much, Daniel, for coming in. I forgot to introduce Cherry Chan, who is going to be in the chat. We like to call her Cherry in the chat, Chan, and she'll be talking to you guys in the chat. Cherry, good to have you back in the chat and back in the studio. But back to you, Daniel. I did want to talk to you about a number of things, but just at the outset, we're talking about over-tourism. What do we mean by over-tourism? Is there a definition as such of it?
Yeah, so of course we're talking about an excessive number of people who travel to a certain place, and it might sound initially like a good problem to have. These people are coming in and spending. We heard it from some of the people who were leaving comments. They're coming in, they're spending, they're supporting businesses in the area, but what these protests are about is about all of the negative consequences, the downsides. So it could be anything from environmental impact, from places just being flooded with people and you being unable to get through, even things like pressure on public services, and in the end, a very serious issue facing a lot of people in a lot of cities, and that is the rising cost of living for locals. And I just want to kick off with one fact, and that is that 80% of travellers visit just 10% of tourism destinations.
Wow. Gosh, that is quite a statistic. By the way, if you're watching these pictures, they are from Barcelona, and those are protests that were held just a couple of weeks ago. And we'll be talking a little bit about Barcelona with Daniel a little bit later in the stream. Thank you very much for that. We're also going to have some other guests joining us. We're going to have Diane Hawker. She is DW's Southern Africa correspondent, and she's going to be talking to us about the situation in Cape Town, which is really struggling with a load of tourists who've been coming, particularly since last year, and we'll explain why that is. And also we will speak a little bit later to somebody who will hopefully give us some solutions to these problems. We always like to be looking at what the solutions could be. That is Professor Cohens, and he is an urban tourism expert. So he will be joining us from the Netherlands a little bit later on. And Cherry, talking of him, you have interviewed him before for a piece that you did actually about this subject.
Yeah, I actually did a report about a year ago when there was a wave of protests against tourists in Europe, and I had a chat with Professor Cohens, and it was really interesting and insightful, so I'm looking forward to our discussion later.
Great, and you can ask him some clever questions then.
I hope
because
so.
you know what you're talking about.
We all do.
And we know that you cherry-picked that guest particularly for that report.
And I also cherry-picked a poll
There
question.
we go, look at that.
Let's not forget about
We hadn't planned that at all.
Yeah. So today we are asking, are protests against tourists justified? There are 4 options. Yes, over-tourism is a problem. No, tourism boosts the economy. Maybe better rules are needed. Or the last one is responsible tourism is key. So don't forget to vote, and we will talk about the result later.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I look forward to that. So let's talk about Cape Town now. It's obviously a city that is very popular with tourists. Some stay just for a few days, some stay for much longer. And last year, the government introduced a special visa. It was a digital nomad visa, and that was to attract remote workers to Cape Town. It's proved to be very popular, but it's also annoyed and frustrated locals. I'm going to show you now just a section of a video reel that our Southern Africa correspondent Diane Hawker did for us a few months ago. Let's just watch that and then we will speak to her in a moment.
Cape Town has become one of the top destinations in the world for digital nomads.
A week in my life as a full-time travel blogger and content creator currently in Cape Town.
Cape Town is one of my favorite destinations I've ever worked from, and that's really saying something.
But locals are saying digital nomads are making it impossible to afford rent here.
People from Cape Town are being pushed out of Cape Town.
I cannot afford to compete against the euro and the pound and the dollar.
It's easy to understand why Cape Town is so attractive to digital nomads. There's the ocean, there's Table Mountain, and there's just so much to do here. Cape Town has always been a popular tourist destination, but now digital nomads are staying for longer and making Cape Town their home for months at a time. This means they're not staying in hotels, but renting apartments instead.
And Diane joins us now. Thank you very much for joining us, Diane. That's great. And just to say that we will put that whole reel in that video in the chat. Cherry will be doing that as we speak. So obviously this has become a very big problem in Cape Town. And we've talked a little bit about some of the issues, but actually it started before even this digital visa was introduced. Just explain when the problem really started to escalate.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm also a first-timer, so good to be here. I would say the situation kind of started unfolding just after the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's really because of the way that work has changed across the world. In South Africa and everywhere else, a lot of companies started introducing work from home options, which really allowed people to choose where they could work for a few months at a time. And so from, maybe late 2022, 2023, when tourism started picking up again, that's when we started to see more people coming to stay in Cape Town for longer stints, 3 months or 4 months, working from here, and then essentially chasing the sun, going to somewhere else where they can work, where it's quite warm. And I think that's one of the things that has made it quite difficult, because obviously, Cape Town is a city that's really built around tourism. A lot of people's jobs are dependent on tourism. If you think about, people offering tours, if you think about people who work at hotels and other tourist establishments, they want the tourists to come. But it becomes difficult when areas like the one that you're showing now, which are areas that are close to the city center, become so expensive that local people can't even imagine, paying the rent there. So in an area like Sea Point, which has become very popular amongst tourists, rentals can be as much as 42,000 Rand. That's about 2,000 euros a month. And if you consider that South Africa's average salary is 28,000 Rand, which is, less than half of that, people simply can't afford those kind of rentals if they are earning local salaries. But it becomes much more affordable for people who are earning dollars and euros, as we heard from some of the people who are responding in that video. And I think, if you look at the geography of Cape Town, it's got a mountain on one side, it's got the ocean on the other side. The area where the central business district is located is really squished geographically. So people are really trying to get as close to that area as possible. And we're now seeing areas that would have previously been low income areas like Woodstock. Their property prices are also going up. Property in Woodstock for a 2-bedroom apartment, for example, you can expect to pay around 1,000 euros, which is 19,000 Rand. Again, that for a South African earning an average salary would be more than half their salary, and it makes it really difficult to afford that. So now you're seeing a situation where a lot of South Africans who want to live close to where they work have to move much further away. They're spending a lot on commuting to the areas where the jobs are. And they really want the government to intervene in some way to make it more affordable to live in this beautiful city that everybody wants to come to.
That's a lot of detail, Diane. Biresha, thanks so much for providing that. Just want to bring in 2 comments. I mean, one is in the form of a comment, the other is more like a comment and a question from the community that's been listening to you talk as well. So we have Elkin Jimenez, who is saying it's a hard comment to read out, but I will read it out nonetheless, saying they depend on tourism. They don't know how to manage a great economic opportunity. He calls it ineptness, and I wonder what you think about that, Diane. And another comment there from Carolina Vilena. Carolina, hi, one of our regular community members. She's remarking that it looks like an Airbnb type thing in Cape Town, something that we've seen in certain capitals in Europe, in which the prices, a lot of rental accommodations weren't available because they were on Airbnb, and it also sort of priced locals out. So I wonder how you'd like to sort of respond to these 2 things.
Well, I think to call it ineptness maybe is simplifying it a little bit too much, because people know in Cape Town that they want the tourists and they need the income from the tourism industry. But what they're also saying is that we need to live here. So there needs to be some kind of a balance. And what's happening is a response to a significant change. So it's not that it's always been like this. It's that the global changing picture has had an impact on the Cape Town communities and also other communities around the world. The comment there about Airbnb, that's 100% correct. There are a lot of apartments that would have been part of the normal rental stock for citizens that have now been placed on Airbnb, and even new companies that have popped up that are now advertising more specifically to these kind of longer stay customers, so 3 months or 4 months at a time, and new developments even in the Cape Town that are very specifically focused on that. So I think what people are saying more is that there needs to be a response to the change that they're seeing, because the circumstances are different and that they are now feeling the pain of this change, essentially.
Let's just bring in Daniel Winter, who's with us from DW Business. We talked there about Airbnb. Yeah. Probably we need to give them some kind of right of reply. Yeah. You have spoken to the company yourself. What about this whole argument that these short-term rentals with companies like Airbnb and others are to blame for much of what's happening in many of these cities around the world?
Well, we spoke to the co-founder, Nathan Blachasik, shortly after New York City cracked down on Airbnb listings there. And he says that Airbnb is a net positive and that people turn to the platform to earn some extra money for their living costs, for their bills. If they happen to have a space that they can rent out, they use that in order to be able to live off it, basically, so that it's good, therefore, for the local economy. And they're saying that they're cooperating with local governments to come up with things like registration schemes and to work on regulations that ensure that tourist apartments are transparent, so that they're also paying their taxes as well, for example, or that they're not putting apartments up that are going to harm people's health because they're so mouldy or damaged, and some complaints that we saw in the past. What they're arguing for at Airbnb is a sensible middle ground on regulation. What that looks like, I guess, would depend from case to case. But certainly they say that banning Airbnb goes too far and that will hurt cities in the end.
OK, thank you. Back to you, Diane, then. We've heard that what a big company like Airbnb is saying. I'm just interested to know what the local authorities in Cape Town are saying about this, because I guess with this digital nomad visa, they obviously believe it's been a great success, even if locals disagree. Do you have any response from them?
Yeah, the local government definitely sees the visa as an important introduction and a way to boost the local economy. The mayor of the city of Cape Town has gone on the record a number of times saying that he believes that the influx of digital nomads is definitely positive for the city. And then I suppose a response to some of the calls for intervention is just last week they mentioned that there were some regulations put in place, amendments to bylaws that would allow for first of all, what they're calling micro developers. So that would be people who want to build additional accommodation in their backyards to be able to provide that without having to jump through as many hoops with getting approval from the municipality. And they're also talking about releasing other municipal land, which is something that people have been calling for a long time, releasing municipal land to make more affordable housing. The problem, I think, is that the timeline isn't clear on how soon that's going to be introduced, and also who will qualify for the low-income housing. And you might have a situation where you have what's been called here in South Africa a missing middle. So that's something we've seen in the education sector, where there are provisions made for people who are on the low income level, but then you have people that don't qualify for that, but also are not high income earners, and they then make up that missing middle. And then the question is, where do those people get housing? So I would say some responses, but there is still need for, I think, a timeline and also more clarity on what about the people who wouldn't be qualifying for low income housing.
Mm-hmm. There has been talk about taxing short-term rentals as commercial properties, certainly in other cities. Is that something that is being pushed for in Cape Town, do you know?
It is something that some of the NGOs who have been lobbying have spoken about, but I wouldn't say that there's been a clear response from the government. The stance from the government, both at municipal and provincial and national level, is that tourism is a very important part of South Africa's economy. If you look at how many countries qualify for visa-free entry, you can see that that is really something that the government is pushing for. And they don't want to put any unnecessary barriers to allow tourists to come, but rather be able to use other ways to increase local housing, so that in a way both different groups can benefit from the situation.
I'd just like to sort of bring in a few comments here, Alex, to go back to what you were saying, Daniel, about these potential outright bans on Airbnb. We have a user Skyline expert saying, and not that it should be outright banned, as there is a difference in renting a spare room/guest house versus the entire apartment. Just a comment there from a user. And we also have another one of our regular users, Nilay Chaturvedi. Hi, Nilay, who is, and this is particularly for you, Diane, he says, Tourism has another downside, that is, it's seasonal, meaning unlike manufacturing or other services, as soon as calamity strikes, tourists flee and locals are on their own while their jobs and economy take a hit. Is that something that is happening potentially with this nomad visa that we are seeing in Cape Town?
Well, I mean, I would say that the seasonal nature and the impact of calamity is definitely something that we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa's tourism numbers dropped drastically simply because people couldn't travel. And they've slowly been ticking up. I think the difference with the digital nomads is because there is a longer stay. So some people are staying for 90 days. Some people are even staying for that 90 days, leaving the country to go to one of the neighboring countries like Lesotho or Botswana, and then returning to the country, that you're seeing the kind of duration of the tourism season also changing slightly. And because there's within South Africa also different climates, you do see some people going to Cape Town for 3 months in peak summer, and then going to someplace like Durban, for example, to stay for shorter periods where it's a little bit warmer. So the advantages to South Africa are significant, I would say, for the digital nomads, and that's, I think, why it makes it a good option. Of course, the currency is also a good benefit because of that euro to rand or dollar to rand. I think it's sitting at around 20 rand to 1 euro. So you need far less euros or dollars to be able to live a really good life in South Africa, and also potentially travel to other destinations during the cold season. So I think the nature of tourism is what we're also seeing changing here. The nature of where people go, how long they stay, what they're able to do in that time is definitely changing. And the response from governments needs to be able to be as agile as what we're seeing in the tourism sector.
One thing I just wanted to ask you, Diane, is that you just mentioned Durban, and there has been, when I was reading about this, it's quite clear that there are people within South Africa themselves who are travelling to Cape Town. Internal migration, they call it, because they think, you know, it's more beautiful, or for whatever reason. Is that part of a problem? So it's not just the, you know, the outside tourists, it's also migration that's happening within South Africa.
Yes, absolutely. That is a trend that has been seen definitely since the work from home or remote work situation came into effect. People are moving primarily from Johannesburg and Pretoria, which has always been, you know, South Africa's economic hub. But I think because companies have become more flexible about whether they want to see people in office and bums on seats, that's where we see people moving to Cape Town. And Cape Town is very attractive for a number of reasons. You know, its municipality has really done good work in terms of making sure that where there are power cuts, which we call load shedding here, that there's less load shedding in Cape Town by procuring power from independent, you know, power providers. The utilities are in much kind of better condition when it comes to water supply. So even locally, you do see people moving there. But I think there's a slight difference when it comes to the nomads, because many of the internal migrants are still earning rands, and they are to a lesser extent going to the areas where we're seeing the property prices really ratchet up.
And you were mentioning to me earlier about your own sister who's looking at doing the opposite of what other people are doing when it comes to Cape Town.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because it's so expensive. I lived in Cape Town for a few years. I studied there and I moved to Johannesburg for work. And my sister and I kind of did a swap, and she moved to Cape Town. But now, because of the prices increasing so much, it's really difficult for her to buy property in Cape Town, which she would like to do. And her rent is also going up. So she's looking at the situation and thinking that Johannesburg might be a better option. Moving here, she could get, you know, a 2-bedroom apartment for about half the price of what she could expend in Cape Town if she was buying it in a really good area. And that's quite a big difference, because also a lot of people who are buying property in Cape Town might not be buying for it to live. They're buying it as investment properties. And that also tends to push up the price quite a bit.
Diane Hawker, thank you so much for joining us. We'll let you get back to whatever you're doing at the moment, but thank you for all that. It was very interesting to listen to. As I said, we've put your reel in the chat so people can watch it at their own convenience. And we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Bye.
Thank you.
Very interesting stuff, and lots of points picked up on there. We've talked about some of them, but before we move on, we have talked about South Africa. We know it's not just South Africa. Another country that has been hit by this quite a lot is Spain. You've got something that you can show us.
I do have data, yeah.
Yeah, this is from Statista, and it shows us that you can perhaps explain what this shows.
Yeah, so this is basically a survey that was conducted, and these are the results of that survey. This is from YouGov. And it basically says, as the headline reads over there, a third of Spaniards say their area suffers from over-tourism. And just look at the numbers there. So Spain, about 32% of respondents, that's basically a third of Spaniards there saying that they do believe that their local areas have been overrun by tourists. A much higher percentage than France, which is at about half that, at about 18%. Germany, interestingly, at 13%. Denmark and Sweden at 5%, and Britain, where you're from, at 7%. Not many tourists going to...
No.
And you're from as well.
Which is surprising, because you'd think they would, because of London.
Exactly.
Got, there are lots of things to see. But interesting. Let's just stick with that, though, because one of the cities, we talked about it earlier and we saw some pictures, but the city of Barcelona, and we can maybe just show those pictures again that we saw earlier, but that's had a big problem with over-tourism, huge numbers of protests. As I said, these were a couple of weeks ago in June, but we've had protests over the past few years of locals just saying enough. Even stories of people, we see water pistols there, but tourists being squirted with water pistols. Certainly that was pretty bad, I think, a couple of years ago. Just talk us through what the main issues are there in Barcelona and why that's maybe a slightly different city to others.
Yeah, so the big issue that people in Barcelona are facing is that their rent has gone up massively. We're talking about 70% increase in rents over the last decade. And in terms of people wanting to buy a home, that's gone up 40% in terms of the price. And it's not just about the cost of living as well. There are environmental issues, just a handful of cruise ships, because it's a popular destination to arrive or depart on a cruise from the Mediterranean. Just a handful of ships emit around 3 times more air pollution than all of Barcelona's cars combined. And of course, there's all of the things that come along with that as well, such as congestion, overcrowded public transport, more traffic jams. A lot of people, even in Barcelona, are saying that they're hearing their language less. So people are coming and speaking either international languages, or they might speak Spanish, but they don't necessarily speak Catalan. And so that it's eroding part of their culture as well. That's another issue which they pointed out.
So what are they calling for? More regulation? What about things like having a rent cap, which is certainly something that we know a little bit about in Berlin. But are those the kind of issues that they're fighting for? Well,
definitely they want to get rid of holiday rental flats. So we mentioned Airbnb as well. There are many other providers too. They want a drastic reduction or a ban. And we'll get to what the actual government is doing in a second. But just to talk about the demands of these protesters, they want a drastic reduction in tourist arrivals as well, of course. No new hotel or cruise infrastructure, heavier tourism taxation, and protections for affordable housing, which could include rent caps as well. Whether rent caps are effective is another matter entirely. I mean, in Berlin, it's kind of been a mixed picture because what you could say is that it discourages investors from building, which means, and the big thing to get down the price is actually to increase the supply of homes. But there has been a response so far from the local government there, and they say that they're not going to renew licenses for short-term rentals from 2028, though. Now, some of the protesters say this is kind of too little, too late. It essentially amounts to an outright ban, but they say, no, we want it now, essentially.
But that's difficult when you think that Barcelona, it seems to be a city that's pretty much built on tourism.
Absolutely.
So that is going to hurt.
I think it's a good point that you sort of brought up, because people are observing this as well in the chat. I mean, you have Amy Carcatera, AC, commenting that that's Barcelona, should be a happy city getting more dollars. And then you also have this question from Nile Chaturvedi, who points out, I don't know what your sources are, Nile, but then it's interesting, the statistics you're presenting here. What options do countries have? Tourism is a huge industry as percentage of GDP. For Spain, it's at about 12%. That's what our regular user is presenting. And for Italy, about 10%. If local governments curb it, wouldn't jobs and economy take a hit? And just one other point while I'm talking, this is from Mr. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, so bear with me, I'm going to do my best. Mr. Porcupas. How is it that 20 years ago nobody complained about it? Today it is a problem.
The usernames are fantastic,
they
I have
really
to say.
aren't they?
Really, really creative.
It's always a challenge for me. Thanks for presenting me with that challenge, and thanks for your comments.
Well, I mean, this gets to the heart of the issue, right? Because it is a balance, and it always has to be a balance. But where do you draw that line? And for Barcelona specifically, tourism makes up about 1/5 of the whole economy. Yeah. So you could imagine that would be thousands and thousands of jobs which would disappear if you ran down the tourist industry, if you really, really clamped down very hard. And I think that we will certainly see some reaction come 2028 when this effective ban comes into effect, because then you'll only have the hotels left, the licensed hotels, and they've said that they will not build any more hotels. Mm-hmm. That will be the cutoff point, and that will be, I guess, the proof of the pudding will be then in 2028. But of course, businesses will say that this is absolutely vital to take in the tax revenue which we use to provide public services. But, of course, are the funds going towards public services or just investing more in tourism? And that's why the protesters have said that they want to increase the taxes on tourist arrivals. And, they say that these should be earmarked for housing projects. And that's what Barcelona City Council has said. Will increase the tax per night that people have to spend when they come and stay in Barcelona, and 25% of that will be earmarked for housing projects, housing policy in general.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. I think this is a really good point for us to bring in our next guest, because, of course, we can talk a little bit about Barcelona, but we all love, or most of us do, exploring cities and going to new places. But there is obviously this balance between that and the tourism and the people who actually live there. So we can introduce now Professor Co Coens, who is a professor of the New Urban Tourism Research Focus at In Holland University of Applied Sciences. Very good to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm sure you were listening to some of that discussion there, particularly about Barcelona. Is there anything that you would like to pick up on that we were discussing and that Daniel from our business department was talking about there? This sort of the issues between trying to obviously make sure that tourists are welcome, but at the same time putting in some quite strong barriers, you might say, from 2028 by ensuring that no new hotels and that these short-term rentals are pretty much going to stop?
I mean, I think it's very interesting. If you listen to this, that cities, and it's not just Barcelona, of course, but also other cities, are really trying to take new kinds of measures and quite extreme measures to deal with this. And what I find very interesting is that the new taxes, that then the 25% will be used to support housing. And I think that is very interesting, because at the core of the matter, also in Barcelona, is a lot of these protests originated as protests against decreasing quality of life, decreasing circumstances of livelihood. And tourism was one element of that, but it's not the only element in it. So to now see that we start to use funds from tourism specifically to create broader urban development to possibly deal with some of the issues that tourism contributes to, but is not the sole contributor to, I think that is a very hopeful way to deal with it. Because up until now, we've seen too much that tourism is just seen as a separate economic sector, without taking into account its dramatic, potentially social and environmental effects.
Do you think that these protests that we're seeing, not just in Barcelona, but around the world, are kind of a tipping point now of where we are with this, that people are just saying enough is enough? Can you see things changing significantly going forward?
I can see these protests increasing and also more organized protests. Whether that will limit tourism, I think it's very difficult because as long as worldwide affluence rises and as long as there's relatively cheap mobility, it's going to be tricky to stop visitors from coming. And also we can cut day visitors, but then it's very easy to go and stay in a hotel in a nearby city. And then you just come as a visitor. So I think that is very tricky, but I do see this increase of people who really get annoyed and start to organize more. And I think that is a very interesting development, because I think that is possibly how we can engage the debate and how we can deal with the debate in a much more structural matter that goes beyond just tourism. Because if it becomes a city problem for the politicians in the city, then more possibilities will probably arise than when it is seen as just an economic nuisance.
Professor Cohen, just on that point, because you were talking, I think that you're talking about some sort of a balance and some sort of a balanced approach that can sort of lead to long-term solutions. This is something that a community member, TKB, is posting in our community chat, who's saying locals shouldn't be hostage to tourists completely. Surely there can be a balance between long-term residents and people moving through. So a sentiment that is shared by some of our community members as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you were just talking about with these protests. A lot of them seem to be a particular anger about a housing crisis. Do you think that over-tourism is basically the housing crisis in disguise? Is that what really is fundamentally moving people to go out on the streets and protest?
I think it differs. The term over-tourism is a great term because it can mean anything to anybody. That's why it is so popular. But if you break it down, often you see that the issues break down in, let's say, three main issues. The first is just a number of visitors. And that's like if you go to city centers, historical sites, just a number of people can be very annoying. It's just too many if you're a resident and you want to get from A to B. And then the second one is the behavior. You don't need an awful lot of tourists to get a really strong sense of this is too much. For example, if tourists behave badly, get drunk, get rowdy, get noisy, you only need a couple of groups per week, and it actually starts to get really annoying. And then third is this physical infrastructure, and that's what we now see, and that is what the crisis with regards to the housing really refers to. But of course, it's not just a housing crisis, it's also in important city centers a retail crisis, when local shops have to shut down because they all become tourist-aimed shops. And I think that is a very fascinating one, because that is very different from those other two. So I think that is what gets a lot of people on the street, but at the same time, the other nuisances or the other disturbances also get people agitated and annoyed. So I think it's like a triple whammy on this one, where it's not just one problem. It's not we solve the housing crisis, we solve the tourism problem. I wish it was that simple, but it's not.
OK, I want to hear what some of the solutions could be, but Daniel, you were going to come in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out what some of the industry leaders are saying. So the World Travel and Tourism Council says that the tourism industry should not be blamed for wider issues like housing shortages, which often have complex, deep-rooted causes beyond the sector's influence. And we mentioned Airbnb earlier. Well, their CEO, Brian Chesky, says that Airbnb is being used as a convenient scapegoat for failed policy and deep, long-standing housing issues. So I wanted to ask you, Professor, if you would agree with those sentiments, because we've seen in lots of places like Berlin. Berlin doesn't have an over-tourism problem, not yet, but it has also seen massive increases in the cost of housing. So could it be that it is being used as a scapegoat, the way that the CEO of Airbnb claims?
I mean, I think scapegoat is a very harsh word. I mean, there is an issue with the short-term rentals and the extra pressure they put on houses, because there's just an economic incentive. And I agree, that's a systemic problem of our urban systems. That is, you can make more money out of it if you just rent it out via short-term rental. That does not exclude the tourism industry from taking any ownership or responsibility at dealing with this issue. Because it's you see it in so many places, even in Berlin. I mean, Kreuzberg and Neukölln were amongst the first neighborhoods in Europe, actually, that really reported a lot of issues with overtourism, when you had that transformation early 2010s from being a more residential area to becoming a more touristified area. And I think that's also what you see. The issue is mainly in those places that transform, that go from local, let's say, to more touristy. So yes, I agree. It's too easy to just blame this on tourism. It's partially the housing crisis. It's partially the policies that are there in place. I mean, we have a lot of policies that make it very easy to rent out your house. But it's also there's a lot of companies renting out houses, and a lot of people doing that earn quite a bit of money with it. And you could put more of that money into your local community. And I think if that would happen, you could address some of the issues.
Can I just bring in a question that is there from a community member? And just before I do that, Professor Coens, I'm also one of those tourists who goes to Kreuzberg and Neukölln to visit those areas. So I'm guilty of that. There we go, another thing common between us. So this is a comment it's a question rather from TK, who says, I feel like the concerns with tourism really amped up when Airbnbs infringed on rental availability and housing costs. If there are hotels, why do we need Airbnbs in cities?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, they are there because it was possible to have them. And I think you can do without them, but what you do see now, particularly in big cities, I say, that have a lot of hotel capacity already. You do see in smaller cities that Airbnb actually has I should say certain rentals, because there's other ones, but they actually serve a function in that when there is too little hotel capacity. But in the bigger ones, one could say, yeah, we don't really need them. But it's very easy to say that. It's very easy to make the policies to address that. And I think that's why you see policies take long to development. You see now that we are getting policies that become more restrictive and that become more targeted, because it's not just restriction, it's also like knowing why you do it. But this has taken 10 years. And that's just because policy is slow and big tech is fast. So, yeah, I can see that that's the concern, that like, why do you need them? But unfortunately, they are there. And they serve function in certain places, but in the biggest cities, they can, one could do it without before they were there. But what you see now, and that's also a problem, is that a lot of people live in these places and they need some income to actually maintain living there. The original idea of Airbnb, as they call it. So people have become economically dependent on it now, and then it becomes much harder to deal with it. And it's just because it took too long to make policy. But that's the nature of policy.
Yeah, Professor Coens, I don't know if you remember me, but we have talked a year ago. I remember when I was doing the report and when I was interviewing you, you mentioned a concept which is touristification, and I found it very fascinating. And can you elaborate more here and why this phenomenon is also driving this sentiment towards tourists?
Yeah. I mean, and touristification is that process of areas becoming more suited to tourists and visitors in general. But what is interesting about it is, even though it's called touristification, it takes it a little bit wider because it also includes, you can have touristification of an area without tourists. It can also be that people like me and possibly you too, those who like to go to the more edgy parts of cities, even in my own city, I can go there, and I am a middle-class, white, middle-aged man with more economic income than others. So those areas can then be made to suit my needs, even though I live in the area, in the same city, and that can bring on touristification. And we've seen that happen an awful lot more now that we see digital nomads really taking hold. So there's quite a lot of cities where you see touristification with relatively smaller amounts of tourists, like day visitors and tourists.
And is there any way to stop that then, if that's something that makes people angry or makes the local residents angry?
Well, I think the main, I mean, there's no magic cure, but I think the main thing that we really need to work on more is stimulating compassion for the others and understanding that our behaviors as visitors actually impact on people. I mean, it's so easy because tourism, well, you come there for leisure, we just use this city. And in essence, you're then extracting the city because you pay money. So I pay money, it's my city. Of course, that's not the case. So that compassion for the other helps. And at the same time, it's also useful for people who live there to better understand, okay, but why do these people come here? What do they want? And how can we, this sounds very idealistic, but work together to actually manage this in a better way? I mean, how can you talk to each other rather than talk at each other? And I think this is what you often see, that there's so much, we blame the other, whereas a lot of the problems are just unfortunately caused by the system. That's why there are no easy solutions. It's a matter of policy, it's a matter of supply, demand, different people with different interests. They're just an outcome of the world we live in today, and it's a very clear outcome of that. But of course, you also see that in other parts of society.
I mean, I have to just say here that I'm British, and British tourists don't always have the best reputation. I think that's fair to say.
That's absolutely true.
Including in the Netherlands and Amsterdam. I think you've been quite strict on certain ages of British tourists coming in and what they're allowed to do, and I think that's been the case in other parts of the world as well. So I just wanted to say that because, Daniel, you are also British. Yes?
I'm also British, and you know, I also have a TikTok account, and so when I'm swiping through, I often see Brits behaving badly abroad, and so I wanted to apologise to you first, and to the Netherlands, and in particular Amsterdam. Yeah. I think Amsterdam has the most amount of over-tourism in the world, and certainly in terms of how many people arrive compared to how many residents they are. And I imagine that the Brits are a significant part of that.
Although I was in Amsterdam in March and I felt that I behaved very well. I just want to say that.
Well done.
Wasn't there a news report about that?
Should we give her a medal? What do you think?
British tourist behaves well in Amsterdam.
Give her a trophy.
That must have made a headline
Anyway,
somewhere.
moving on. You were
Thank
talking
you,
there.
Alex.
You were talking there. I'm going to call you Co. I know you're Professor Co Coens, but I'm going to call you Co. We're chatting, you know, there's a chatty stream here. You were talking there about getting people around the table, different stakeholders, and you actually worked on a sort of simulation game, which I think that Biresh might be able to show us in a moment, where you were trying to get different stakeholders around the table to try to deal with these kind of issues. We'll just play the pictures, but it would be good if you just explain how it worked and how it is working, because we want to know, is there a solution to this problem?
Like I said, there's no simple solution, but we can work towards solutions. And this is one. This is to stimulate that compassion and empathy. So people got different roles from the ones they normally have in the tourism system. And what this game did was show people that to address the issues regarding tourism, you need to work from the start in a coordinated way with a lot of different stakeholders. And a lot of these stakeholders include ones that currently don't even know that they're involved in tourism. And that could be a bit like up until recently, the housing sector was a bit like, oh yeah, that's a tourism problem. But it's also mobility. Like, this is a very important sector, of course. But it could even be, like, if you want to use tourism for good, which is, of course, now what we all say that should be a solution towards over-tourism, it can also be, for example, there's an aging crisis, a lot of lonely people, etc. Could you use tourism for that? But to do that, you need to know what you can do, and that it's also your responsibility. So what the game did successfully was that it showed all stakeholders, look, we are in this together and we need to do this together rather than leave it up to some department or just the tourism industry because it's all their fault. I mean,
Professor Cohen,
is it?
Professor Cohen,
actually, Daniel was just going to say
sorry.
something.
I just wanted to know, what does good look like? Because there would be many people who'd say, like, investment in an area is good. Others would say that's gentrification, and rather you should preserve things as they are. And you probably can't keep all stakeholders happy.
You definitely cannot keep all stakeholders happy. No, I think it's for this. I think personally, I think it is important to listen to the people that are actually living in an area and have lived there for a longer time. And you need to balance that, again, the word balance, with the wider economic interest for the city. But again, then you need that conversation. What do you actually want? And we've seen it several times that there is this big plan to bring economic benefits to the cities. And then you start to talking to people in that neighborhood. It's like, would you want that? What do you think it could bring you? And it's like, yeah, it doesn't bring us much. We pay for the rest of the city. And that's not the way it should be. So I think these are very careful discussions or conversations that you need to have, because there are different variants of importance. People want different things. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to bring that all together. But it's so important that you are, at least from the start, transparent about what you do, and that you take people seriously. And if you cannot deliver, don't promise anything. It's very easy to say, like, the tourism is going to bring you benefits. But unfortunately, let's be honest, we often have this debate where we'd say, either you say tourism is bad or tourism is good. But the reality is, like, tourism has some very problematic sides to it. But we can try to limit them, and we can try to stimulate the better sides. And if you hold that discussion, that conversation with people, it's much easier to create some sort of like conversation where you can find unity and you can find agreements, rather than going into like, oh yeah, but we just need to do this for the benefit of the city. We just need to make money, in essence, or we just need to improve the city. Because improving for who?
I'm sorry I'm interrupting, Professor Cohen. Just on this example of tourism for good and tourism for the community, I wonder what you make of what they're doing in Copenhagen, because if I'm not wrong, from mid-June, is it, till August, they run a program in which tourists can come and, for example, like in this case, they can try and pick out trash from the river in exchange for a free ride on this boat, or they can try and do some gardening in the city in exchange for some coupons in a restaurant or some concert tickets. I'm forgetting what this is called, but do you think models like these would work, or could offer us a glimpse into some sustainable tourism and tourism for good for the future?
I mean, I think these are very interesting developments. I also can't remember the name of the program. But the issue now is this is an experiment, and experiments are great. And I think it's very useful to see what comes out of it. And of course, similar things happen in other cities as well. The idea is like, how do we move from being an experiment to making this mainstream? Because that is the real challenge. It's interesting to focus on what can we do here. And I think this is a very fun example and an interesting example of what you can do. But the trick is now, how do you keep this from being a niche that, let's say, 20 tourists do and 200,000 tourists do something else? Yeah. And it's that change that I think we need to work very hard on, and then you need to really engage a lot of stakeholders.
That program, I'm sorry to interrupt, that program is called Cope and Pay, Professor Cohen. I just saw it in one of those brochures. It is, I think, what Copenhagen is hoping to make a wonderful experiment.
Wonderful, wonderful. You wanted to get that in at some point.
And Cope and Pay, I wanted to get that in as well.
What about tourism taxes? Because we're seeing more and more of those being introduced. For example, just this week, Greek authorities have announced a €20 tourist tax on people arriving in Santorini by cruise ship. And we know that Cannes is also going to introduce something similar. Does that actually make a difference? Does the money go to the right people, or is this just authorities saying, look, we're trying to do something?
Could be all of those. The issue with the taxes is, like, depends on the amount. Like, taxes €20, it seems a lot, but if you have a cruise that costs 1,000, 2,000 euros, yeah, it's not that much, is it? And then it comes to, so I think then it can provide a lot of income for a destination. But then the question is, what do you do with that? How are you transparent about what you do? And again, in the Barcelona example we started in this conversation with, if the city says we're going to be transparent and spend 25%, it has to be very clear that 25%, where it goes and how it goes, and it does not go into just a general budget, because that breeds massive cynicism from all sides, both the industry and residents. So that's transparency is key there. If you really want to make it work, those numbers need to be much higher. I mean, Venice also has an entrance tax. It's 10 quid. You're not going to not do it for it.
Yeah.
Bhutan, as a country destination, I think with them it's a lot higher. I can't remember the exact amount, but I think it's something like $200 a night.
Yeah, you were talking about Bhutan, weren't you?
We were discussing Bhutan because they restrict the number of people who come in to the country, and you can really see the impact of it. It just remains clean, beautiful, and green, and cold if you go in the winter. But just on the point of solutions, people have been commenting. So you have Felipe Cortes saying that people are justified. Tourism gets certain people rich, but not most of the population. And you also have DeVos, who is saying, I think there are many pros and cons of tourism. I think this is where better regulations come in, and not regulations in favor of the capital class. So a certain class of people should not get rich as a result of regulations, but it should sort of percolate to everybody.
But it has to be said, doesn't it, that, I mean, after the financial crisis of 2008, many people thought and felt that the best place to put their money, Daniel, looking at you as well, is in property, it's investment, and that's what lots of people have done. And surely that must have led to part of these problems, that that's where the capital is, they're investing, house prices are going up, so they're going to make a quick buck, or not so quick, but they're going to make money over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the thing, that there's a lot of people in these times who have struggled. And one of the things that they have, and we're talking about the haves and the have-nots here, of course, there are some people who've invested all of their lives in their property. Maybe they pass it down to one of their children or whatever. And so they're going to use that asset. And they're going to use that, either they might sell what they already have to invest somewhere else, perhaps as a second home. A lot of retirees in Britain will buy a home in Spain, for example, either to live there or just to visit it on a regular basis. And then what about when it's empty? Well, they might want to rent it out. And so it's understandable that they have gone this route and tried to maximize what they can with the assets that they have. But then there are the people who are trying to get onto the property ladder at the moment, and they are finding it impossible to even buy a deposit. And what Professor Coe said, which I thought was particularly important, is we're not just talking about entire cities. We're also talking about specific neighborhoods where this tourism might be concentrated. And so if you were born in that neighborhood, grew up in that neighborhood, and suddenly you can't afford to buy a property there, that must be devastating, especially if you've based your entire kind of identity, your family history, your close connections, your friends are all based in these neighborhoods. And these are ties, once they're broken, that you can't necessarily put back together so easily.
Thank you. I just have one final question that I'd like to ask you, Professor Coe. If you were advising a city mayor right now, given everything that we've just been talking about, and they were saying, look, how do we balance this? We've got these locals, we've got people who are resentful, they say that they can't live in their city anymore, they can't buy a house, they can't rent a house, it doesn't belong to them, with the city also saying, but we need the tourists, we need the money coming in. What advice would you give to somebody, a mayor, who was trying to deal with that?
Well, first of all, get your policies straight when it comes to, if you talk about short-term rentals, how to deal with that. But also when it comes to second houses, there's also a policy you can make for that, because that's indeed an important part of that issue. And at the same time, try to create new homes for people. That is one thing. And start that conversation to see how tourism can be made part of just the city debate. Stop seeing it as an economic sector, start looking at it as a society debate, because you can't easily solve the housing crisis. There's just way too many difficult elements to that. But what you may be able to do is say, look, we can find together benefits that tourism may bring to a city that could help you too. So that could make your city a little bit better. And then you may have to move out of your neighborhood, but at least you can move to a neighborhood a bit relatively close to it, because it's also, like as you were saying, not the entire city is filled with tourists. And if there are places where there is still space to live, etc., you could invest in that to make that a place with more facilities or with more green, make it more attractive, so that at least it's more enticing for more, like for more people. And of course, then you're still dealing with, do we then push people out? And that's of course what you don't. But this is I don't have a massive solution. I do think that the key is that we need to really talk more to each other and find these best practices as you just shown, and also start working with them. And at the same time, if you fail, and we all fail, I fail an awful lot with all the things I do, be open about it, because we do not learn from only sharing our successes. And I find it difficult to learn from why things have not worked, because nobody shares them.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we did have a message from somebody called TK in the chat, who was appreciative of you saying that people need to talk and there needs to be more transparency. So people obviously really taking on board what you're saying and agreeing. Thank you very much for your time, Professor Coe-Coens, our urban tourism expert. Great to speak to you. We know it was quite a long conversation, but hopefully lots of people have picked up a thing or two, and it was good to speak to you.
Great to speak to you. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, that very interesting conversation. A shame that there isn't a single solution to this. That's what we want, don't we? One solution.
You mentioned something that TK said. Going back to TK, lucky you, TK, you're getting a lot in today. There are people with 5 homes and they leverage one to get the others, all on Airbnb, and the owner is just all over the world. I mean, this shows how much of a cycle it is. For people who have property, they can borrow against that property to buy another property, then they have 2 properties, and they can borrow against those to buy another, and so on. So if you're in the game, you can expand and expand and expand up until the limit that regulation comes in, or up until a bank says, no, I want to see some actual hard cash, some income from this. But if you can get mortgages on these places and have fixed income coming in from the rents that are being paid, or from Airbnb, or from wherever, then you can use that in order to expand your empire. And so once you're in the game, then you can just grow and grow. And then that means that people who do not have that advantage are struggling. And it's that effect which creates this kind of whirlpool, which fixes all of these investors into one area and allows them to expand at the expense of the local population.
So perhaps we're blaming over-tourism for this, but there are many more factors, as Coe-Coens was saying as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And this is a nice segue, isn't it, into another video that you have been working on that you can do a very short plug for.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Hi, guys, I'm Daniel, and I also work here at DW. So I just did an interview on the cost of housing crisis, essentially. And so we looked at New York City, and there is the mayoral candidate, Zohran Mamdani, who's been all over the news lately talking about how he would like to radically reform renting in New York City if he becomes mayor. The actual elections are in November, but he's managed to get onto he's the candidate for the Democrats now. And there's some serious problems that he thinks that he can fix, but the solutions are rather radical and controversial. So if you want to check that out, then you can head over. Obviously, you're already here. You're already on DW News. So once we've finished, look for that video, click on it, and you can find out all about it.
I will share the link, in fact, of the video.
Thank you so much.
You don't even need to look for it. It's available on demand. That's how we like to mix it up.
Cherry, before you do that, you still have a job to do, which is to tell us about the poll.
Do your work, Cherry.
Exactly, yeah.
You're just watching videos all day.
Exactly. I introduced the poll question. Of course, I have to talk about the result of the poll. Yeah. Where was this again? Here. I've got. OK, so I'll repeat our poll question again. Are protests against tourists justified? We've got 171 votes. 33% says yes, over-tourism is a problem. 23% says maybe better rules are needed. 21% says responsible tourism is key, and 20% says no, tourism boosts the economy. They're quite close, all the options.
It's very close. There's no real clear-cut answer, right? And then maybe this is what, going back to what Professor Cohen was talking there, it's about having a conversation. And a conversation is what we are about.
Yes, we are. But that conversation is now coming to an end.
No.
It is. So thank you very much for everyone who stuck with us. Really interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Daniel, especially having all those numbers at your fingertips.
Did I do a good job?
You did do a good job. Yes, we'll give you a round of applause. Thank you.
That piece you're working on, that link of which you'll be posting in the chat. And as you go check out Daniel's work, you can also wait till next week when we shall be posting on the Tuesday what we'll be talking about next Wednesday.
Yeah, so thank you very much for being with us. We look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.
See you next week. Bye.